Okay, I think we're going to start. So let me briefly introduce my colleagues, and this is a genuine pleasure for me because the four people you see on the screen are some of my closest colleagues, people with whom I've worked regularly, and who provide excellent perspectives on this important topic. Viraj Solanki is our research analyst for South Asia. Hasan Alhasan is our research fellow for the Middle East based in Bahrain. Camille is our research associate for the Middle East, also based in Bahrain. And Yuka Koshino is our research fellow for Japan based in London. Their bios are available online, as well as their long list of publications, including on this very topic. So I certainly encourage you to check this. So the ISS conducts a lot of work on Gulf Asia relations, and the four people on the screen have all contributed to that massive amount of analytical work and data gathering that the ISS has put out. So we thought it would be an important and interesting topic to explore today, how Gulf Asia relations have fared during and after the pandemic, whether there has been any qualitative change one way or another. Have the countries decided to cool their engagement, or to the contrary, boost it off? So we will look at issues such as energy, transfers of technology, political and security relations, labor exchanges, and so on. And we will ask the question of whether the geopolitical competition that's on in the Indo-Pacific has repercussions on Gulf Asia relations. What I'll do is I'll start asking my colleagues a number of questions about their views, the insights that they've gathered over the past years, and then we'll turn to a Q&A. We'll take the questions and answers through the chat function that is at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to already ask your questions. I'll combine them at a later stage. So let me first turn to Hasan Alhasan in Bahrain and ask about how the Gulf states approach Asia and have approached Asia in the past 2 decades. What is the combination of economic and geopolitical factors that has driven that engagement, and what are the differences between countries? Which country in the Gulf cares more about which country in Asia, and how did they go about building those special relationships?
Thanks, Emile. All very good questions. I think the broader picture that more or less applies to most of the Gulf states, and I focus here primarily on the Arab Gulf states because the picture looks slightly different with Iran, and we can go into a discussion on Iran. But I think in the post-Cold War period, the Gulf states have all more or less been interested to varying degrees in establishing diplomatic ties with the big Asian powers. So China and India especially, but also Japan to an extent, and the smaller ones like Pakistan and South Korea. And I think this was especially the case in the late, we could see the beginning of this in the late 1990s, but it really took off around 2006 onwards with the very symbolic visit of a very symbolic Asian tour by the late Saudi King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, really turning to Asia for his maiden first foreign visit as the Saudi king. I think China was much quicker to reciprocate Saudi Arabia's interest than, say, India, for example, was. But by and large, I think there was an incentive to diversify the foreign relations of the Arab Gulf states, especially in the aftermath of 9/11. Relations with the West were becoming a bit tense, and the aftermath of the 2003 Iraq War as well. And so I think there really was a geopolitical incentive in that sense for the Arab Gulf states to diversify their foreign relations away from an overwhelming reliance on Western security partners and to try to look for new partnerships as well, in addition to those traditional ones in Asia. Economically, I think there was an early recognition that China, Japan, India, that these were going to be and were at the time the big export markets for Gulf oil and gas. And that's a strategic commodity as far as the Gulf states are concerned. But I think, and of course, with countries like India and Asia and the rest of the South Asian nations, there is a labor element as well, a migratory people-to-people link, so to speak, that is also extremely important. But of course, there are important variations among the Gulf states as far as the enthusiasm and priority that they allocate to their relations with the Asian powers. So I think the UAE is probably ahead of the pack. It's one country that has both a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China and a similar one with India. By far, it's one of India's top trading partners. It's China's top economic partner in the region as well. And so it really has established, because of its centrality as a trade hub and as a magnet for FDI and the foreign direct investments in the Middle East, has the most advanced set of relations. Of course, Saudi Arabia also is an important partner for these states. I think countries like Kuwait, for example, have lagged behind considerably. So Kuwait is probably at the other end of the spectrum and probably has the least developed set of relations. And then, you've got Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, somewhere in between. Obviously, Oman has a privileged relationship with India, for example, military defense ties that go back. China is an important creditor to Oman, and there's a clear interest in Oman's ports and infrastructure project. Bahrain also has good relations with India and Pakistan, less so with China. Relations aren't that advanced. And Qatar as well hasn't made a particularly strong effort at pushing the sort of the Asian file. So the UAE very much at the forefront, Kuwait lagging behind, and the rest somewhere in between, I would say, if one were to simplify things while sacrificing a degree of nuance.
The way I see it from what you're saying is that the Gulf states essentially face a dilemma. I mean, their current and future prosperity lies in the East, while their security still lies in the West. And that's how hard of a balancing game has it been to reconcile these two tensions? A question that I will put forward to Camille a bit later as well.
Traditionally, it wasn't very difficult to balance those relations because there wasn't necessarily a geopolitical trade-off. But as the US-China geopolitical competition in the Indo-Pacific, but also, of course, involving other players like India and Japan and so on, intensifies, there are attempts at these trade-offs start to become more felt here in the Gulf. So we've seen the US trying to scale back on, impose certain hard choices on the Gulf, especially in terms of partnering with China, for example, on new emerging technology. And that's something, of course, that Camille might also want to get into. But I think from the Gulf states' perspective, there is a strong resistance, strong pushback against these kinds of zero-sum narratives that are being peddled by the US. It's becoming slightly more difficult to manage that balance. But I think by and large, despite this increasing sense of difficulty, by and large, I think this is something that the Gulf states have so far managed rather well. So China is their largest trading partner. There are growing investment linkages with India and China as well, although with India, it's a bit difficult because of regulatory and sometimes political issues that act as an impediment to greater Gulf investments. But the Gulf states are, the UAE, Saudi Arabia are already very important players, say for India's energy security, for example, in an investment sense, right? So they invest in India's strategic petroleum reserves and so on. So I think by and large, yes, the more the geopolitical rivalry in the Indo-Pacific intensifies, the greater the trade-off for the Gulf states. But I think the Gulf states still are trying very hard to compartmentalize their economic relations with the Asian powers from their traditional security partnerships with the Western nations, obviously the US being chief among them.
Thank you, Hasan. Let's move a little bit east. Viraj, South Asia is very close to the Arabian Peninsula. There are dense political, cultural, human connections between those two regions. How would you describe their evolution in the past 2 decades? Is it, the very transactional one that we saw at the time where South Asia would provide labor and the Gulf states would, accept remittances and, develop a one-dimensional policy towards India and Pakistan in particular, or was it more complex at this moment?
Thanks, Emile. I think, firstly, when talking about South Asia, I'm going to focus my remarks on India and Pakistan, but other South Asian countries each do have their own bilateral relations with the Gulf states as well. I think on your question, overall, India and Pakistan have now, at this current stage, diversified their relations away from the traditional energy expatriate-focused relationship to a real two-way relationship between each of India and Pakistan and the Gulf states. So, for example, with India, we've traditionally had a relationship focused, I think, on energy, trade, and expatriates, with India importing, for example, 2/3 of its oil imports from the Middle East. It has over nearly 9 million citizens residing in and working in the Middle East, and has strong trading relationships, as Dr. Alhasan mentioned, with the UAE, India's 3rd largest trading partner, and Saudi Arabia, roughly 4th or 5th as well. So that's really been a key part of India's relationship traditionally with the Gulf. But I think under Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India, we've seen a growing engagement and also diversification in relations, as the word that Dr. Alhasan mentioned as well. So, for example, we've seen a political focus from Prime Minister Modi visiting the Gulf states. So his visit to the UAE in 2015 was the first Indian Prime Ministerial visit in around 34 years. His visit to Bahrain in 2019 was the first ever visit by an Indian Prime Minister. So this shows a real focus from this Modi government in engaging with the Gulf. And now this diversification, I think, has come into a different area focused on, firstly, investments, with India trying to seek investments from the Gulf and energize economic growth in India. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has committed to invest $100 billion in India, and the UAE is committed to invest $75 billion, and there's been investment linkages between the Indian Ambani's Reliance Industries and Saudi and the UAE as well. But also now we're seeing a diversification, which we can talk more about later, in terms of defense and security relationships. And this is really deepening, especially in the areas of counterterrorism, maritime and naval cooperation as well. And then for Pakistan, again, the relationship has been traditionally one focused on expatriates and labor, with around 5 million of its citizens residing in the Gulf. It's had traditional strong defense and security relations with the Gulf, including defense training. But now we're seeing growing financial ties and economic ties between Pakistan and the Gulf. And for example, this has come in the form of loans from Saudi and the UAE towards Pakistan at a time when Pakistan has been facing financial difficulties. And there has been ups and downs in the relationship between Pakistan and the Gulf recently, in particular over issues over Kashmir last year. But I think relations between Pakistan and the Gulf remain strong, and there's now a growing economic focus in this relationship as well.
I mean, let me ask you, how has Pakistan, for instance, navigated the Gulf rift between Saudi and the UAE and Bahrain on the one hand, and Qatar on the other one? You know, did Pakistan feel pressed to take sides, or did it just, you know, adopt a fence-sitting position? Same, you know, question perhaps about the Saudi intervention in Yemen. I mean, you know, you remember that there were expectations in Riyadh that, you know, Pakistan would contribute. And is that accepted, that, you know, Pakistan will most times try to be a fence sitter rather than an active participant on security on the peninsula?
I think, especially on the last point, in terms of Pakistan's refusal to join the Saudi action in Yemen in 2015, I think that actually itself, that decision from Pakistan being a so-called fence sitter then, meant that it led to Gulf outreach towards India. So that, I think, acted negatively on Pakistan's relations with particular Saudi Arabia at the time. And I think that was actually the beginning of a growing outreach from the Gulf towards India. But I think in terms of balancing its relations, I think it has become accepted as a fence sitter, but I think this is actually at the detriment of its relationship with the Gulf, and we're now seeing the Gulf states and India, with whom Pakistan used to traditionally have stronger relations with the Gulf than India, but because of this stance that is taken, I think now this has actually been negative in terms of its own relations with the Gulf, and it's actually boosted India's relations with the Gulf and led to a diversification of its own relationships with the region.
And would it be fair to say that the Gulf states, particularly Saudi and the UAE, need to keep an eye on developments in Afghanistan, will help in a way restore or maintain this relationship with Pakistan, which seems to be a pivotal state? Do you think that's going to be the channel for the Gulf states to keep their eyes on developments in Afghanistan?
Yes, I think Afghanistan will be a key arena for wider engagement with Pakistan. Traditionally, as we know, in the 1990s, the three states that recognized the Taliban government were Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Pakistan. And I think at this time, Pakistan has really focused its engagement on Afghanistan in dealing with neighboring states. For example, it participated in this Iran-led regional conference earlier this week. So there is an opportunity, I think, for, in particular, Saudi Arabia and the UAE to engage more closely with Pakistan on the issue that are occurring in Afghanistan. But it remains to be seen, I think, the extent to which Pakistan is willing to engage with the wider region on issues, or whether its main focus now is dealing with the neighboring states to deal with the situation in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Viraj. Yuka, let's turn to Japan. It used to be the case that Japan was a primary energy importer from the Gulf states, but also a provider of goods and a builder of infrastructure in the region. How has this relationship evolved since then? Is Japan still a primary economic partner of the Gulf states? And how much importance do the political and economic elites in Tokyo give to their engagement in the region? Is that a region that has high priority on the Japanese policy agenda, or not?
Thank you, Emile. And as Emile has mentioned, historically, Japan's relationship with the Middle East has been very important because it has been the source of Japan's economic growth, and especially the post-war recovery, and source of economic growth when Japan became the world's number two economy already in 1968. And already by 1970s, Japan has been feeling that the stability in the Gulf region is very important for Japan's future economic growth, as well as it has experienced, for instance, back in 1973, the Yom Kippur War between the Arab states and the Israeli, and then the oil embargo that accompanied by OPEC, and how Japan was not did not do well in terms of navigating the geopolitical tensions, and how that resulted in the largest recession since World War II. However, because the Gulf and the Middle East has been geographically quite distant from Japan, its security role, although they understand the need of security, their security role remained to be minimal. But still, even today, after many diversification efforts and efforts to reserve oils, Japan relies 88% of its oil import from the region. So the stability and the security of the region still is a very important goal for Japan's foreign policy. Maybe the changes that we have seen over, especially the past decade, would be really the changes brought about by the Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, which has been one of the first prime ministers in the last 2 decades to have a more proactive posture on its diplomacy, which is often described as the proactive contribution to peace, or taking a panoramic view of the world in diplomacy. And through that activism, Japan's relationship with the region has kind of shifted from its an energy-based economic relationship to taking a more proactive geo-economic role in the region, trying to help the region transition its economy to the post-oil economy, economic diversification. Another interesting change that we have seen under Prime Minister Abe is its effort to play a more increased political role. Especially after the U.S. Trump administration and the destabilization of the region occurred by the pulling out of the JCPOA and the rising tension between Iran and U.S. Prime Minister Abe visited Tehran, I think for the first time as a leader in 10 years in June 2019, to try to serve as a broker between the U.S. and Iran. Although there were some failures after being welcomed by the attacks against the Japan operated ship in the region, there has been some setbacks, but that is an interesting development, and that also shows the need, how important the stability of the region is for Japan.
Thank you. And in terms of Japan's geo-economic or economic engagement of the region, are there specific industries or sectors that the Japanese are very keen to engage on? And is there a favorite Gulf states for Japan? I mean, are they targeting, I don't know, UAE or Saudi in particular in terms of, their engagement, their offer, or is it, a very commercial one? Whoever wants to buy essentially buys.
Right. I think there's various sectors actually. One probably priority area is kind of transitioning its current energy relationship into a more green energy relationship, I would say. As the world and as the US administration, as Europe kind of shifts and prioritizes the climate change issues around climate change and efforts towards carbon neutral goals, Japan, under previous administration, under Suga, has also announced to achieve carbon neutral by 2050. So for instance, importing hydrogen from the hydrogen created in the region to Japan is a new kind of areas and opportunities for economic relationship. Other areas include, COVID-19 has also revealed the importance of medical technologies and in that in that area, and it's not just the COVID pandemic, but also just generally because of the growing kind of obesity rates in the region, and how Japan has some health technologies and robotics that could help the regional countries meet some of those ongoing kind of challenges, existing challenges, are another area of potential cooperation. But also the third part maybe could be more around the role of Japan's soft power. Seems like there's the data shows that there's interest in Japan's culture, and that could also help kind of the region shift more towards tourism. So those are kind of, I think, several of the many areas that Japan is trying to pursue. In terms of favorite country, I would say Japan probably see Saudi Arabia as a most key important economic and strategic partner in the region. And as a evidence, Japan and Saudi Arabia has agreed on this Japan-Saudi 2030 vision, which kind of puts everything together that I've said about what kind of role Japan wants to play in terms of diversifying the Gulf states' economy, and it seems like that Japan is also in negotiation with UAE to put together a similar agreement. So I would say Japan is Japan's kind of #1 relationship in the region would be Saudi Arabia, and then UAE, and it's also trying to cultivate relationship with other countries.
Thank you, Yuka. Camille, China, kind of important country and all that. The Chinese standing and footprint in the region have really increased recently. I mean, any visitor to the Gulf states in the past 2 decades has seen a sea change in terms of the presence of Chinese goods, Chinese technology, Chinese financial institution, joint cooperation with on development finance and things like that. So what is driving China's engagement in the region at the time? Is it a purely mercantilistic approach? Is it, and more importantly, is the energy relationship today the same as it was 20 years ago? Has it changed?
Thank you, Emile. So as you say, the energy relationship is really at the core of that relationship, and for China, the main driver was its energy security, and we have seen this relationship with the Gulf that has become increasingly interdependent. China for its energy security, and Gulf states for their government revenues that still rely a lot on energy. But as you say, there are some questions on how this is going to evolve in the coming decades. For sure, China is going to remain very, very dependent on Gulf oil in the future. This is not going to change anytime soon. But the long-term picture is difficult to really have an idea of what it's going to look like. And we have seen during COVID, that has accelerated the global discussions that we had on energy transitions. There is this question of how China's economic future is going to look like. We've seen that the Chinese economy is also facing some difficulties at the moment. So what is going to be China's growth in 10 or 20 years? China is making a lot of efforts to try to improve its own energy transition, and this is and we're seeing already that this relationship on the energy side between the Gulf and China is becoming a bit more asymmetric on China's favor. And China is also making efforts to diversify its sources of energy with other countries that are not necessarily in the Gulf. And it's still unclear how this is going to transform the picture on the longer term. But the interest of China in the region is not just based on energy. There are different elements. There is, as you were mentioning, the rivalry with the US. And so for China, securing and making headways in among some of the US very important allies in the region is something that is useful to it. The Gulf also lies along some of the most strategic maritime trade routes. that are very important for China's trade with Europe. And so securing access to these trade routes is something very important to China. There is a fear in China of encirclement and of seeing the US potentially, in case of an escalation with the US denying access to China to some of these very important markets. So developing relations in this area is very important. And there is also, you could say, for example, these countries, as you mentioned very quickly, but these countries are leaders of the Muslim world, especially Saudi Arabia. And for having their support, especially on issues like the Uyghur issue recently on international forums, this is something that is also very valuable for China. And so we have seen also China trying to leverage its influence in some of these countries to obtain votes or support on international forums in favor of Chinese positions on a number of issues that are more directly related to China's core security interests. Because in terms of security interests, China's core security interests are not really in the Gulf, and it's not that interested in playing that security role that some people have been imagining sometimes of China replacing the US in the region. So when we look at China's interest in the Gulf, we have to think that China's primary interests remain in the Asia-Pacific region and on its core interests closer to home than the Gulf countries that are still appearing to China as a complicated region where it doesn't want to get entangled into too many complicated geopolitical dynamics.
Thank you. I mean, that's a question to you, but I'm also curious about Hasan's take on that. If that's the case, how does China reciprocate? I mean, you're talking about how the Gulf states are providing political cover to China on the Uyghurs issue and others. They don't denounce or criticize China's role, whether it's in the region or beyond, publicly. They buy technology. They push the US away when it criticizes Gulf procurement on technology and other things. But how does China reciprocate to all that? I mean, one example, I mean, a prominent one, has to do with Iran. The Gulf states have tried for a very long time to get China, also Russia, but in this case, we'll discuss China, to take a harder line on Iran. And, earlier this year, we had this announcement of a, 25-year massive strategic partnership between Iran and China. You've written about that, but, how does this meet Iranian Gulf interests? Same thing with Chinese purchase of Iranian oil, especially these days, which allow essentially Iran to circumvent American and EU pressure on the nuclear front. So, how does China take Gulf security interest into consideration? Perhaps not at all, but you'll tell me.
I mean, when it comes to Iran and balancing Iran and the GCC, China's position has been to, its interest is to have a region that is as stable as possible, as balanced as possible. And so when it comes to Iran, for example, it has been very critical of the US maximum pressure on Iran. And so, for example, purchasing Iranian oil has been a way to maintain a sort of lifeline to the Iranian regime to try to compensate a little bit the US maximum pressure on Iran. But at the same time, it's not interested either on seeing Iran becoming a power that is too powerful either. And so it is, for example, on the JCPOA, that's why it's been interested in pushing for JCPOA, making sure that Iran doesn't acquire the nuclear weapon, because this is not either on China's interest. But as you say, the Chinese have been quite clear on the fact that they wanted to compartmentalize issues and political issues from economic ones. And until now, Gulf countries, I think, GCC countries have understood that to some extent, and they acknowledge themselves that they don't really have the leverage to push China to do anything specific or to pressure Iran on specific policies. And so they probably partly accept that matter of fact. But at the same time, yes, it's probably one of the factors of why they're willing to cultivate this relationship with China, is at least trying to keep that channel open to potentially try to hedge against Iran. But yes, they have very little leverage. And when there were these announcements of the 25-year deal between China and Iran, although you can really discuss to what extent this is what, as important as what has been portrayed sometimes in the news. But on the GCC side, you could hear quite a lot of concerns of what that could mean exactly. And that is telling as well of the extent to which these countries have little understanding of what China is doing exactly in the region and how Chinese policymakers are thinking internally. And it looks like they're trying to guess themselves what's the thinking in Beijing about the region, and that is also telling in terms of the depth of that relationship, because on both sides, on the Chinese side like the GCC side, they're both trying to figure out what the other is doing, and there's still a lack of good communication and good understanding of what the security priorities are on each side.
And a final question before turning to the others on this, Camille. We talked a lot about the US-China competition. How does it play out in the Gulf states? I mean, what do we know about US demands of its Gulf partners on this front, to downgrade the economic relationship, to stop buying certain types of technology? What do we know about how it's playing out?
So recently there has been this relationship with China has become an important point of friction between the US and its Gulf allies, and there is a strong growing sense of frustration on the US side, because they have bases in the Gulf, they have sent troops to the region to secure the region, they have invested quite heavily in developing military capabilities in the Gulf, and they have the feeling that now Gulf countries are cozying up with what they consider to be, their systemic rival. The problem is that the messaging from the US side has sometimes maybe been a little bit unclear in terms of what exactly were the red lines and what were the sticky points. Recently, the main issue has been crystallized around Huawei technology on 5G infrastructures in the Gulf, because all GCC countries have signed agreements with Huawei and where another to have Huawei equipment in their 5G networks, and the US have been concerned about the security implications for them in terms of surveillance, in terms of China getting access to potential, US military technologies, or using also this as a leverage for disrupting the networks. So there were some important concerns on the US side. But the problem is that on the 5G case, for example, for a long time and until today, it is still complicated on the US side to explain clearly to their Gulf partners what are the exact security risks, because it's just an emerging technology. So you don't know necessarily very clearly what are going to be the security risks in the future. So the messaging to Gulf countries has been a bit maybe unclear on this. And there is also thinking that it's not just about one technology, but it's about the broader picture. It's about the fact that on top of the 5G networks, Gulf countries are also deepening relations in AI, for example, which can have also security edge. They develop economic relationships in a number of sectors that are, increasingly strategic, and that also gives, more leverage to China. They deepen the relations also in the security sector a little bit. We've seen with the, China selling some UAVs, or even starting to work with some countries like the Emiratis or the Saudis to develop their own domestic capabilities to develop these UAVs. So this is it's difficult to say what exactly is going to be a security concern. It's the whole thing that becomes a security concern. It's also if China invests in ports and strategic infrastructures, what kind of leverage it gains in terms of deny access in case of issues with the US. So it's about addressing this whole picture that is difficult.
Thank you, Camille. I'm curious to hear from Yuka about whether and how China's engagement in the Middle East shapes Japan's view of that. I mean, Japan has this very rule-based approach to things. You are the utmost expert on the free and open Indo-Pacific, and those concepts that Japan tries to push out. But when they look at China's role in the Middle East, is that the driver of its own engagement? And does that suggest that down the line, if China increases its security role in the region, Japan will feel compelled to do so, or Japan will feel compelled to provide some technology to be in competition with what China offers?
Thank you, Emile. I think that's a very great question and very important one as well. I think it will become a certain driver for it will set the direction for Japan's relationship with the region. For instance, in my first, comment I mentioned about the stability and security of the region is important, but I think beyond that, well, you mentioned the free and open Indo-Pacific diplomatic vision that Prime Minister Abe launched in 2016 in TICAD, but it initially did not geographically include, at least looking at the government documents, it did not include the Gulf region. But now, because China's growing role in the region is challenging the rules-based order or the free and openness of the economic and political order, also in the Gulf region, so that it seems like from what we've been hearing from recent high-level visits, like Motegi's visit, Foreign Minister Motegi's visit in August just this year in August, they have begun kind of promoting their idea of the free and open international order in the region. So that shows that there's growing interest in Japan to engage the region. And another example of how China's growing role, especially in the technology front, is seen as a challenge for free and openness, is that it's not just about the matter of the security of the actual 5G infrastructure, but the fact that China is growing through the vehicle of the Belt and Road Initiative, or if you were talking about digital infrastructure through the Digital Silk Road kind of vehicle, that not only allows China to kind of spread some digital infrastructure like 5G data servers and all that with some security risks, but it also allows Chinese companies to grow by scale, which allows them also to set standards for future technologies and even norms about cross-border data transfer. And China, as have been promoting a more protectionist approach to data, and it does not work well with the Japan's position on data free flow with trust, which essentially is a free flow of data with some security component to it. So Japan's concern is kind of beyond just the actual infrastructure side, but what might come in the future because of the China's role. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Yuka. That's very important to know. I mean, Japan is a technology provider, at least it's seen like that from the region. So it may have a role in the future when it comes to that. Viraj, I mean, still talking about China. China has, very different relations with India and Pakistan, the two countries that you cover and study. With India, it's increasingly a competitive relationship that can be conflictual at times. With Pakistan, it's a collaborative relationship, and Pakistan is, if anything, increasing its dependence on China. How does that play out in the region? I mean, Pakistan is a key node in Chinese infrastructure, at least BRI and so on. Does this have an impact on the outreach to the region? And in particular, is India interested in the Gulf region because China is, and then therefore India feels the need to double down on its outreach?
Thanks, Emile. I think India and Pakistan are both engaged the Gulf in part because they have their own relations, differing bilateral relations with China, and not just because China is now growing its own engagement in the Gulf. So I think as part of this, with India, for example, you have, as you mentioned, the growing and adversarial relationship with China, and that has led to India seeking to engage with like-minded partners throughout the Indo-Pacific region, including in the Gulf region, for example, through this offshore balancing and trying to engage with different partners. And India is also trying to diversify its relations by dehyphenating its relationship with Pakistan in the Gulf. So I think, as we've seen, India has been quite agile in terms of its relationships and balancing the different adversarial relationships in the Gulf, for example, previously with Israel and the Gulf, and Israel and Palestine in the wider Middle East as well. So I think that has been one element of its relations. But I think in terms of China's impact on India's relations with the Gulf, I think it's twofold. One is we're now seeing a real step change in terms of the defense and security relationship between India and the Gulf. As Dr. Alhasan mentioned, India has access, for example, now to the strategically located Duqm port. It's developed naval exercises with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with the UAE, and held a naval exercise in August also with Bahrain. You have the Indian Army Chief visiting the UAE and Saudi Arabia for the first time in December last year. So that is one real element which shows that its willingness, by seeing the Gulf as part, and the Western Indian Ocean as part of its strategic extended neighborhood, that's one area where it can seek to try and counter Chinese influence in the region. And then secondly, I think in terms of the relationship of with different partners in the region. So India has been more willing to engage in minilateral groupings, and I think this was really shown last week with the foreign ministerial meeting of Israel, US, India, and the UAE, which I know this is not directly linked to China, but this provides an opportunity for India to deepen its engagement in the Middle East, while also deepening its engagement with the US and with Israel as well. So this is really an opportunity for India to be more agile diplomatically and pursue different relationships in the region. Whereas for Pakistan, I think, as you said, its relationship with China is vastly different. It has very strong relations with China, and that has been the benefit of Pakistan at a time when last year the Saudi Arabia and the UAE asked to repayment on loans, and it had to turn to China for financial assistance on this. But I think in terms of China in and Pakistan's relations in the Gulf, there is an opportunity now for the Gulf states to engage on economic investment with Pakistan, as Pakistan seeks to diversify its own financial assistance away slightly from China, and in terms of its China-Pakistan economic corridor. And there have been, I think just as a final point, there has been a direct impact in terms of Gulf and Chinese investment with Pakistan. So we saw the Saudi Aramco is looking to invest in a $10 billion refinery project which was initially meant to be in Gwadar, where there's been a high levels of Chinese investment, but they got shifted earlier this year to Karachi. So there has been, due to feasibility, so there has been a direct impact of this. And so these are things that we can continue to look out for.
Thank you. Hasan, I want to go back to this question of this new quad, UAE, India, US, and Israel. And ask how this is playing out in the Gulf region. I mean, obviously, last year the UAE and Israel signed the Abraham Accords, Bahrain as well, and so on. And so, in a way, the UAE can be part of this new strategic geometry in the region, right? But what do you think was the driver to that? I mean, was it a China agenda that drove these 4 countries together? Is that something else? Is that a way for the UAE or perhaps other Gulf countries to make themselves geopolitically relevant at this time of great flux? It was quite striking, I have to say, that meeting. I don't know exactly what will come out of it. I mean, operationally, what does it mean? But it's worth it. It's worth examining, especially that the UAE has been at the forefront of engagement with China. It hasn't been trying to balance against China, and yet here it is with the US and India, who both have China at the top of their list of concerns. So, what's your take on that?
Thanks, Emile. I mean, the problem with these multilaterals in a region that is geopolitically, extremely complex, as we all know very well, is that it's very often, I think, even for the actors involved, even for the players involved in these multilateral arrangements, to identify a clear underlying geopolitical motive, right, or objective. I think everyone tries to see everyone looks at this through their own geopolitical lens. And so, on one level, you're absolutely right. I think the Indians would like for this to be about China. The Israelis have been, and the Americans as well, probably. The Israelis have been very clearly pushing against this. So we've heard the Israeli diplomats in New Delhi saying, absolutely not, this is not about China. And I don't think that the UAE would want to be perceived as peddling an anti-China agenda either. On another level, you could see an Iran dimension to the quadrilateral format as well, because this started out as a 3-way discussion between the UAE, Israel, and the United States at a time when US-Iranian tensions are slowly beginning to rise as a result of the stalled nuclear diplomacy, and so we're seeing greater. We're seeing military exercises at the moment between Israel and the UAE. So there could be one could also see an Iran dimension to this, which is probably what the Israelis and perhaps the Emiratis would like to see, or that's the prism through which the Emiratis and the Israelis probably view this group. But I suspect that the Indians, for example, would absolutely be unhappy with an anti-Iran connotation being seen in their own participation in this quadrilateral format. I think it's always extremely tricky, and I think ill-advised to look for. There are no region-wide clear-cut alignments. There are, overlapping meshes of issue-based alignment. So, for example, right, India is part of this. Joined as sort of the 4th member of this trilateral arrangement that could have an Iran angle, but it's very much aligned with Iran in terms of developing the international north-south transport corridor. And we've seen a big Indian push in Central Asia. The External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, was in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, trying to incorporate Chabahar Port more closely with the international north-south transport corridor, trying to find an alternative route north as an alternative to Azerbaijan because of the Iranian-Azerbaijani tensions, and rerouting the route to Georgia and to Russia through Armenia. And so, it's a big mess. And looking for a clear-cut region-wide alignment, I think, is doomed to fail. I think what we'll see is states trying to become, I think, as Viraj rightly put it, nimble diplomatic actors. But I think from the Gulf states' perspective, what is extremely important for the Gulf states is this idea of decoupling. And so the Gulf states are extremely keen on decoupling their relations with India from their relations with Pakistan. And that's one of the reasons why they weren't willing to take a strong position on Kashmir following India's revocation of Article 370 back in 2019. Partly explains Pakistan's frustrations with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states at the time, although we seem to have moved beyond that as of late. But similarly, I mean, the Gulf states, from what I understand in my own conversations with Gulf policymakers, for the most part, simply don't discuss Iran with China, because the level, the maturity of the strategic dialogue between the GCC states and China is simply not there yet. It's not at the stage where they can discuss third, parties such as Iran or broader regional security issues, even though the Chinese have been a bit more active on the front, putting forward a proposal on regional security, offering to host talks in that regard for the Gulf, but also to mediate Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which is something that they've been saying, that they've been talking about for a long time, but nothing really happens there. But in any case, I think the Gulf states are extremely keen on decoupling. And I think that's one way in which they can compartmentalize, build strong bilateral relations without necessarily being entangled in very complex geopolitical dynamics that end up spoiling and getting in the way of better bilateral relations with all the different actors.
Thank you for this masterclass in Gulf strategic diversification and hedging, Professor Hasan Alhasan. I mean, I see, point well taken. I mean, ultimately, it's about trying to not take sides as often as possible, because the economic agenda doesn't allow for this. But I want to go back to the issue of hard security here. I mean, when I look around, India is not a hard security partner of the Gulf states. Pakistan has had a security relationship with a number of Gulf states over the years. Japan doesn't, I mean, it engages in some naval visits and so on, but is not really a player when it comes to that. It has focused anti-piracy. It often stays away from counter-proliferation initiatives as well. It's very careful about what it does. China, Camille, correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, it has opened a big base in Djibouti, its first base abroad. That's just around the corner from the Arabian Peninsula. It's very important for Bab el-Mandeb. But do we see a Chinese appetite for a hard security involvement, or is it, is this a one-off example that shouldn't be overstated? And if you agree with that picture, I go back to Hasan and say, is there a security alternative to the US when the Gulf states look at all that? So, first, Camille, is China ever, is there any indication of Chinese hard power deployed in the region?
Not really. I mean, there was recently some rumors, but again, like we have this kind of rumors every couple of months of a Chinese base in the UAE that still triggered some concerns on the US side, and discussions of also what is considered a base. Is it logistical, a depot, or is it more than that? But apart from that, really, as you say, the Chinese themselves have been quite reluctant to cross that, and the Gulf states as well. I mean, this would be quite an important red line on the US side, and they still have this very strong relationship with the US. So for them as well, this would look like quite an important red line. And on the Chinese side, I mean, it is a region that is quite far away from their core interest. They already have a presence in Djibouti, as you said, that helps, securing issues in terms of maritime security, or preparing any repatriation of their own citizens, like they did from Yemen or Libya, for example. But we're still far away from a situation where they necessarily want to be, very security involved and with the power to project power in that kind of region. But at the same time, I mean, we never know because, a few, maybe 10 years ago, experts on China would have completely denied the fact that they would have a base in Djibouti. And it still happened, and it's still, evolving, and the tone also of Chinese diplomats or of Chinese leaders has changed a lot in terms of they don't shy away in the way they did in the past in terms of projecting power, further away from their direct neighborhoods. And so we don't know how this could evolve still in the longer term.
Thank you. Viraj, I mean, before ending with Hasan on that, what about, South Asian powers, security involvement in the region? I mean, all this talk about Pakistan being a security provider or offering strategic depths for Saudi and so on, is that still a viable way of looking at that relationship? Did we overstate that relationship in the past, and then we got a reality check in 2015 when Pakistan said no to an involvement in Yemen? How do you look at that?
Thanks, Emile. I think with both Pakistan and India, there's obviously limits to the security and defense engagement that it has with the region. So with Pakistan, there is obviously been this traditional defense relationship, training, and of Gulf officers. We have General Raheel Sharif, the former army chief, heading this Islamic military counterterrorism coalition. So I think that this really is, from Pakistan side, is still a key fundamental area of cooperation, but I don't see it changing beyond the scope at this present time that it currently is, and I think it will continue to be that that kind of defense relationship. But I think with India now, we are seeing, and my final point, that we are seeing this strong defense and security relationship, and I think that is the one key element to watch out for in the India-Gulf relationship going forward. And I think this is key because defense and security ties and developing these strategic ties is really the area that can build trust between India and the Gulf. And I think that is really where the trust between the two sides will develop, and it will develop habits of cooperation, both on counterterrorism issues, on maritime security issues, naval cooperation. So I think this is really the one key element in this relationship to watch out for going forward.
Thank you. Hasan, we'll end with you. And, all this was a trick for me to come back to you and say, okay, we talked about how dense Asian Gulf relations are, and they are. I mean, in terms of energy, trade, investment, cultural, technology, and so on. But when it comes to what worries Gulf leadership the most, which is their security, do they see Asian powers as serious interlocutors, able and willing to do what it takes, or are they in a way trapped in a relationship with Washington that is essentially the main determinant of their statecraft?
I think, to be very blunt about it, I don't think that the Gulf states perceive any real alternative to the US, Asian or otherwise. So no one can fill Washington's shoes, right? There's no other security guarantor that's going to step in. There's a distrust of China, and of course, the US would, in the foreseeable future, is not going to let that happen. The EU doesn't have an appetite for this, except to operate under the US umbrella of the combined maritime forces, or to deploy small maritime awareness missions in the Strait of Hormuz. India doesn't have the appetite or the capability to be deeply committed in a military sense to this region. And so I think there is a realization that the only real alternative to the faltering US security guarantee is an investment in Gulf indigenous capabilities. And I think that is to my mind, that is the only real answer that the Gulf states can and are, I think, offering to make up for the shortfall in their external security partnership with the US in deterring and countering their main regional systemic rival, so to speak, which is Iran. And so when it comes to buttressing, investing in their indigenous capabilities, I think the Gulf states are extremely, and pardon my choice of words, promiscuous in that regard. And so that involves, conducting and concluding as many partnerships as feasible with players as widely varied as, Israel, the Europeans, the Russians, Ukraine, and why not China and India. And so I think the issue is that because the US lens, because we tend to see things from the lens of great power competition, we have this myopic view of Gulf China, say, for example, a cooperation or Gulf China partnership on certain aspects of their indigenous defense capabilities. But in reality, the Gulf states are partnering with Israel, they're partnering with Russia, they're partnering with Ukraine, they're partnering with a broad number of actors in order to compensate and make up for that shortfall in their traditional security partnership with the US in countering and deterring an enemy like Iran. So I think it's often this myopic focus on China that is the problem from the Gulf perspective. But if you were to look at things from the Gulf vantage point, it's really about cultivating as wide an array of partnerships as possible to be able to buy and incorporate the technology that's necessary to create that boost in indigenous defense capabilities. That's how I tend to read the situation.
Thank you, Hasan. That's an excellent point and a great one to end this. Obviously, there is also a topic that we haven't discussed much, which is the more long-term issue of the energy transition and how that will affect Gulf-Asia relations. We'll keep that for another time. There will be plenty of research produced by my 4 colleagues here and others at the ISS to feed our understanding of that. And we will organize a webinar on this topic at a later stage. But thank you very much, the 4 of you, for what is very rich. You may not know that, but those 4 individuals are part of the Emilians at the ISS, the small club of very bright and interesting people who do excellent research. Sorry. But the point is that I was delighted to chair this one. Thank you very much. I'm sure our audience learned a lot as well. This video will be put on our website for everyone to watch. So thank you very much. And thank you for our participants for joining in today. And goodbye.